Great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm so glad you could join us today. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm Emily Homan, I'm the Fire Learning Network Manager, and I'm so excited to have our friends and partners in the Southern Blue Ridge FLN here with us today and presenting on this important and interesting work. So before we get started though, I'm going to attempt to advance this slide. Of course, this worked earlier. Okay, did that change for you, Liz?
Yes.
Awesome, great. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. We do ask that all participants today please mute both your audio and your video. We've really found through all of our extensive Zoom experience in the last few months that having everybody's video on is both a little distracting as well as uses a lot of bandwidth. So if participants could please mute both of those, that would be much appreciated. Please enter any tech questions you have in the chat window. If you have something that isn't working well for you, please do enter those there, and you can either put that in the general message or you could send a message to myself or to Liz Rank in a private chat. There will be a question and answer session following the presentation, so please feel free to enter your questions in the chat window at any time during the presentation, or to unmute yourself during the question and answer session. But we will take all of those questions at the end. This webinar is also being recorded, so please be aware of that. Again, the webinar is being recorded and a link to that recording will be available. All right, so probably most of you today are familiar with the Fire Learning Network, but just in case you aren't, if this invitation was forwarded to you by a partner, just a real quick map to orient folks to what the Fire Learning Network is. We're a network of people all over the country in specific landscapes across the US. And today we're hearing from our friends and partners in the Southern Blue Ridge FLN over there in the eastern part of the United States. So again, very excited to have this webinar today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Portia has to share with us. So I'm going to pass this off to Margaret Bucher. She is a co-lead for the Southern Blue Ridge FLN, and she's going to introduce our speakers today. Margaret?
Great. Well, thank you. I would like to echo what Emily said on greatly appreciating Portia and Adam reaching out to us, letting us know about important work they've been doing, not just in the Southern Blue Ridge, but also across the region. So I'm excited that, to hear what Portia has learned. And turning it over to you, and also would like to acknowledge Beth, my co-lead. She will be facilitating questions in the end. So thank you. Over to Portia, and thank you, Adam, for sharing your student and making this happen.
Hey everybody, I'm Portia Perkins. I'm originally from Virginia Beach, Virginia, and I was a graduate student with Dr. Adam Coates. And I'm gonna share my screen now, and if Adam or Margaret or Emily can tell me if it pops up and everybody can see, so we can confirm that, and then we'll get right into it. Can everybody see? All right, perfect. And I'm gonna move my little situation so I don't have to see everybody while I'm talking. All right, so I did my thesis project on prescribed fire perspectives of African-American landowners in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. And so I first want to give some acknowledgments to the programs and peoples and person groups who helped me achieve my project and helped me find a lot of these things. So MAYOP is a program through Virginia Tech that allows for a diversity of students to come to Tech. And I was a scholar of this program and got to do a lot of things with them, and they helped fund my graduate education. Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy is where I conducted my research out of, had an office with, and worked with Kevin Hires, who is also a member of my graduate committee. And then the Edna Bailey Sussman Fund is a fellowship that paid for my summer of research. And then the William J. Dan Jr. Memorial Fellowship helped me with my graduate education as well. So I first want to give y'all some background just on me and where my history lays a part of the project that I was in. So I'm the first grandchild of the eldest of 14 from Jackson County, Florida, and my great grandma and her parents were sharecroppers in this area, and eventually attained the power to own the land that they have, and that land is now owned by the youngest heir of my family. And the same will occur for me. My mom is a homeowner and landowner, and upon her passing, I will be an heir of that property with my sister. So this illustration here is by a painter who I met when I was in Tallahassee at the time, Alusta Richardson, and we worked with the archivist at Tall Timbers, and his family was a part of this tenant farming situation that would occur where a big plot of land was owned, but they would be paying rent for the part of the land that they owned, and they would farm and grow things and have their own animals, but they also conducted prescribed fire, and they were a part of the elements of prescribed fire that were to maintain this habitat. And so when we went on this journey trying to figure out what my thesis project was going to be, we came across this work called Prescribed Fire, Perspectives on Prescribed Fire in the South, Does Ethnicity Matter? And so it was basically a survey to sort of gauge what the attitudes were for using prescribed fire as a management tool, safety, liability, those sort of things. And they all play a role in the use of prescribed fire on the land. And I felt like they also connected to me personally, to the experiences that I had had in this area, and would come to understand more about myself through the process. So yeah, I think got it. So this is a little overview of how everything's gonna go. I'm basically telling you guys about my project, and then there'll be questions and everything after that Beth will help assist with. So we're gonna go through the problem, study designing exploratory question. What I was really trying to seek out some background in terms of dates and time, study objectives that I had, my methods and analysis, and then my results and conclusions. So the first thing is like, what's the problem? Why am I, even studying this? And it's really, prescribed fire is something that's widespread across the United States. I mean, every year, millions of acres are being burned. But when it comes to private landowners, we weren't getting as much information on exactly how, when, and why they were choosing to use prescribed fire, and even less in those minority groups where we weren't getting feedback from in those landowner surveys. So in the landowner survey that we first looked at, there were also lower percentages for those respondents of colors in those specific areas discussing their perspectives and motivations and reasonings for prescribed fire as a tool or not, and other forestry services, organization service, and management related questions. And I really wanted to fill in that gap and get that insider scoop. As well, I wanted to be able to understand how race and ethnicity impact landowner attitudes, perceptions, and the reasons why they're making the decisions that they make, so that we as scientists and land managers and overall people who want to do better for the planet to which we serve, we can do that in a way that is holistic to all people. So I did an exploratory qualitative study, and I conducted semi-structured interviews whereby I could change or restructure the way I was doing my interview a bit more, and it wasn't so rigid. And I did them all with individual African-American, non-industrial private landowners in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, using rapid rural appraisal as the methodology. And then my main question was simply, what factors are affecting the decisions of African-American non-industrial private landowners to use prescribed fire as a land management technique? That was my main question. Now, there are other questions in there as I get to my objectives that you will see that I also attained that helped me create my full answer towards the end. So to give you guys a little bit of background. So this background is going to cover the decline of African-American land ownership, as well as discrimination in that. I'm going to describe also for you a little bit of the process of getting to the point for the region that I did study of them using prescribed fire on the land regularly. So in 1863, we see the Emancipation Proclamation signed. And in that process, we think of it as a freedom that could have maybe been actualized, but in reality, for a lot of African Americans or previously enslaved persons and Blacks, This wasn't until around 1865 that they're seeing any forms of this true freedom, like we know for the date of Juneteenth, but also Black codes were issued in the similar time, and they were acts of discrimination against African Americans to keep them as a cheap labor force in the South after the Civil War. Because you have to remember that there was slavery in the South, and there was also a war in the South, and so the entire South is obliterated and destroyed, and they need that cheap labor so they can rebuild the society that they once had and maintain the ideas that they want to create. So really the only options until we get into the 1910s, 1920s for a large amount of formerly enslaved persons is sharecropping or tenant farming. And tenant farming doesn't really come till down the line, so it's really sharecropping and convict labor. So then in 1862 and in 1890, the Morrill Acts roll around, and they first instate the ability to have land-grant universities. And then African-American local organizations and churches and people groups also went into the works of creating, and other abolitionists went into the works of creating historically Black colleges or institutions specifically created for African-Americans to come and be educated on the agricultural and mechanical needs that they would have for the area that they lived in. Then in 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau of Beaufort, South Carolina is created. And so when the Freedmen's Bureau is created, it allows for African Americans who now have been working, are debtors workers, they need to attain credit. And so what the Freedmen's Bureau allows African Americans to do is attain credit to purchase land. However, caveat again, is that there is a finite amount of land that can be purchased. And so African Americans and formerly enslaved persons navigate where they can or are allowed to purchase land in a variance of different ways, whether it being them directly purchasing it or their formerly enslaved owners giving them land, or some sort of amalgamation of the two. And what happens in this process of attaining land is also an increase in the numbers of African Americans who own land, and then the decrease enters heirs property. So then in 1867, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is created. And what the Federation of Southern Cooperatives does is give those educational keys, those tools, and those opportunities for them to come together as farmers, as landowners, and conduct things on the land similar to a county extension agent or NRCS county offices would be doing, but specifically structured towards the aspects of the people who live in this region, the limitations that they have encountered, and to address them and allow them to still be prosperous on their land. So after all of these beneficial things are occurring, education, finances, resources, then you see this large number of African American landowners show up. And then in 1914, when the Smith and Lever Act comes along, it creates the Cooperative Extension Service. And the Cooperative Extension Service was a give and take situation where there were still discriminatory practices that were already occurring socially, and they just interwove into the service. However, there were still extension agents who were of color or were not of color who tried to provide resources, but the inherent distrust began in these first relationships with the Extension Service. So in all of the process this is happening, in the 1920s, this cool dude comes along, Herbert L. Stoddard, and he recounts this magnificent experience of utilizing prescribed fire on large-scale plantations for bobwhite quill hunting. And it instantly becomes a thing. So you have all of these rich industrialists coming down to the southeast in order to quail hunt on these big, beautiful plantations maintained by no other than formerly enslaved persons and other tenant farmers. And also now landowners who are creating communities. So in that same process, and later on down the line in terms of acts and legislation, 1964 Civil Rights Act was created. But the gap between the time in the 1910s to 1999 created a steep decline in African American landowners. And this is first understood and really noted by heirs property issues, in which somebody or the title owner would pass away and the property goes to their heir, as I described with my own family situation. But those pieces of the heirs property can be sold in partition sales, and then landowners lose rights or abilities, but also landowners may be interacting with poor management because nobody is on the property or around the property, or they're all heirs, as well as like squatters' rights situations occurring now happen. So the next slides I'm going to show you is the decline of African American landowners over time. So this is from 1910, and I have highlighted in red Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, and Negro and other non-right farm operators. So in this time, it's approximately 247,000 plus. I don't know why I was saying 400, y'all, I'm sorry. 247,000 plus in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, which is quite a significant number comparative to literally owning no land, having no property, and having no credit. And this was all taken in the U.S. Census of Agricultural History Archive. And I did not exactly get what was the amount or acreage of land that you had to own to be considered in this. So I do want to preface that before I continue. So this is a study that came out in 1999. So just 89 years later from that, there's only 68,000 plus in the United States total, covering 7.9 million acres of land. And also, this also means that the wealth and the worth of all that land is also decreasing too. So then again, in 2017, you have another agricultural statistics service, and they go out and they survey, and there's 28,000 left total and 2.4 million acres of land. So that alarmed me as a reason we also need to connect to these landowners and also be in the process of preserving their land in the communities that created their land, because the land quite literally is being taken away from them in a measure of ways. But the number one is heirs property. So where does prescribed fire fit into this dialogue, and what is prescribed fire? So prescribed fire is fire set intentionally as a land management tool to set back succession, promote early successional species growth, habitat restoration, and overall wildlife risk reduction, because we don't want wildfires that we can't control and we can't maintain, and prescribed fire gives us the ability to do this. So in my process of thought of thinking about the ways in which African American, also Native connections upon being in America, but across the African diaspora, have learned about fire and the implementation of fire. And so through my thesis, I learned of different tribes in Nigeria and in Ivory Coast that practice fire as a part of their farming techniques. But also here I found a comparative study that was done with tall timbers with Kruger National Park in South Africa, and it was in Kansas. The photo I have to the left here is from last summer when we did a prescribed burn. I didn't find any photos of the Kansas burn, but the thing that I wanted to note is that there were so many similarities to the savannas that they were burning, and the species that they were burning that relied upon fire, and the frequency in which they burn and the severity of the burns were all quite similar. So it lead me to context that there were similar things happening through similar person groups that could have exchanged over water, over voice, over action, that would have led to this historical knowledge of using prescribed fire on the land. So my study objectives then were to determine if African American non-industrial private landowners in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia used prescribed fire and what were their reasons, to determine the organizations or affiliations that connect landowners to prescribed fire information, and understand how outreach efforts might be maximized to increase prescribed fire use among this landowner base, because overall what we want to see is prescribed fire being used safely and effectively to promote long leaf, short leaf, whatever leaf you want to name, habitat in the Southeast. And then lastly, examine the cultural values of African American landowners possess related to prescribed fire. So to do this, I selected 52 counties of tall timbers conservation planning area, which stretches from the southwestern corridor of Georgia, the southeastern corridor of Alabama, and the northwestern corridor of Florida. And then I used Florida A&M, Auburn University, University of Georgia Extension agents, tall timbers, the Forest Service in all 3 of the states, and then lastly, snowball sampling, which simply is after I would complete an interview, I would ask the landowner post-interview if they knew anyone or could provide me any information for someone if they wish, to allow me to keep interviewing more and more people. And so this is my interview area and my conservation planning area that I work with, and these are the 52 counties. And I'm going to go to the next slide so you can see it a little bit closer. So what I have on the left here is a legend that goes from darkest to lightest, and then the darkest counties are where the highest census population, these are all from census population data of African Americans were, and then the least. And I tried to use this to gauge where I started my interviewing within my area, but it was interesting to see where I saw the most fire occurring and where I didn't see it. But overall, this led me to my starting point. For data collection, I did some structured interviews. I had 13 in-person interviews and 8 over the phone. And in these in-person interviews, I was allowed to go on to different landowners' farms and lands and see where they actually conducted fire and hear some of their familial history, which was very insightful. Each of them were audio recorded. I also kept a personal journal because not only did I do interviews, but I was also doing so many other activities with archivists, and I did an activity with the painter Alesta Richardson, and I was doing so many activities that fully wrapped my brain around what was occurring in this region and how fire played a role in the lives of the children who are now adults and so on. And then lastly, we're interview question script, recruitment script for organization and landowner, and every landowner was required to give verbal and written consent before an interview. To analyze, I simply did verbatim transcription, which simply means that everything that they said is everything that I wrote in the transcription before I started to code. And I broke everything into 3 central themes based on 13 codes. And in the PowerPoint, I have them in 3 themes. And then also one of them has 3 themes within them too. And then the method that I approach this with is a rapid rural appraisal method. And it's basically a fast data collection method made for rural settings to attain community perspectives. And that's literally what I wanted to do. I wanted to be transplanted in this area that they live, talk to the people, understand, how they feel or what their feedback would be, and bring it back and synthesize it into something so that we can understand what those differences are. And this was my transcription code book. Each of these I felt best helped me get what I needed from the information that I was provided through each interview. So acreage, evidence of prescribed fire use, fire adapted species, forested acreage, land connectivity, so the ways in which they connect to the land, which was super important, and also understanding the way that limitations affect the connectivity to land. Limitations of fire use, location, management goal, organization if they name ones. More people had local organizations. Some people were working with the USDA. Process of land ownership, solutions to prescribed fire use, like what it does for them in the process of conducting a prescribed burn, time of land ownership, and then underrepresentation overall. So after conducting my entire project, I was able to interview 21 African American landowners. 19 of those landowners were over the age of 50. 1 was a woman and 20 were men. So you could say that my particular data collection is skewed towards men a little bit because that is who I was able to access through my networks. And then 3 worked on a tract of land that was entirely too huge to consider as their own, but they had 50 plus, 30 plus years of experience conducting prescribed fire operationally on this property. And so they still helped me gauge and understand what that was like in the region. Land ownership overall lasted anywhere from 7 years to over 100 years. I had 2 of my landowners who were centennial farmers in Georgia, which means their family has farmed that land for over 100 years, which was amazing. And then land acreage ranged anywhere from 0.5 to 365 acres, and 0.5 was my starting point, so it was from there on. So 17 interviewees, or 81%, used prescribed fire, and only 4 didn't. So right off the back, my exploratory question is answered that yes, there are African-American non-industrial private landowners who are conducting prescribed fire. And then 9 of my landowners, or 43%, describe using prescribed fire annually or biannually. And then 5 or 23% reported infrequent use of prescribed fire, ranging from every 5 years to about 30 years. And those were based on a lot of different things, as I had asserted a little bit before, about poor management, heirs property, or simply lack of information on prescribed fire. So over to the right here, I have the same map with the color coding from dark to light, but I have included here small fire marks for where those landowners were who were conducting fire and those who were doing infrequent prescribed fire. And Leon County has a singular fire point down in your far right corner, and it is the darkest county shown there. And I thought it was really interesting in all of the connections that I was making to have a map where the fire was occurring, and a lot of it was occurring right there in that Red Hills region where Tall Timbers was a part of by private landowners. So the first of my themes that I connected with was evidence of prescribed fire use and motivations for use. And so as I go through each theme, there'll be quotes, and I will just recitate off the quote, and then I'll kind of just talk about how it connects to context. So the first quote from a landowner says, "They call it the wood rattlers. They look over the place like security. They mostly help burn, you know. They ride along, throw a match out, you know. And also the area where we were sharecropping, my granddad, he used to burn. He used to walk around with a big old box of matches, them big old long matches, and strike, just drop. Basically everywhere that we were farming, he would keep all that burnt." So right off, this told me that prescribed fire was not only in effect, but that it had been in effect for generations, to the point that it was beyond common knowledge, at least for most of my landowners, what prescribed fire was, what it did, and why it was essential to their land. And I felt like that was a very important structure, because in some of the other surveys or some of the other things literature that I was reading, there were not direct ties to why they were doing it and it being a part of what they already knew to do with the land. So I created this flow chart to show how the limitations and the management goals affect the use of prescribed fire. That is why each of the arrows are going back and forth or up and down as they show on the screen. So I had a wide variety of management goals for why people were using prescribed fire or not using prescribed fire. And one of the main ones was aesthetics for people who may have had smaller crops, but there was also wildlife habitat, hunting, timber production, CBD, and pollinator programs. Like one of my landowners wanted to have butterflies on their property as a pollinator program. And some of the limitations that everyone encountered was education, as in targeting programming that specifically targets that small landowner, that minority landowner, that landowner with limitations that affect them socially, financially, and then on their land. And just also education that came with overall awareness. So liability and safety were also parts of the limitation. Having personnel to conduct fire, and the permitting process in general has been seen as a barrier. And then poor management, as I mentioned before, and building subdivisions. The building of closely knit, tight houses, not much open land, makes the fear of fire and also the liability of fire increase, which affects prescribed fire use. The second theme that I found throughout my interviews is the limitations and implications for policymakers, and these are also separated. So the first limitation that I also mentioned in the previous slide is education. One of my landowners said, "See, throughout my lifetime, I've always lived in areas where people around me engaged in prescribed fires. I knew there was some purpose behind it, but I have never taken the initiative to find out why it was done. And I've never had anyone articulate in my presence why it was important." Another landowner said, "Once permits were required, people kind of stopped burning. And I guess the other reason why they stopped burning was because people started building houses." So both of those things were educational parameters that I felt like they were explicitly stating how they were undereducated or not informed as the process of using prescribed fire has changed. In terms of permitting was not required before. So therefore the process in itself is a barrier because it was something that just wasn't done before. So people have to learn how to do it, and everybody's not connected through the internet and everything like that. And then the first one was, this was like one of my first interviews. So instantly I was like, to have owned land and to have lived in an area where fire is done all the time, and to also not have that situational awareness or just people who have the right knowledge to give you to understand that, I felt like that was important, and that would be key in continuing prescribed fire, because easily this landowner can do it on their land, but they need the proper education and engagement with them in their land to do that. The second is the issue of legacy. So as I discussed before, African American land ownership in total is on the decline within just the United States as we see it. So even though they have consciously exerted the effort to engage their relatives or other Black landowners to preserve and continue the work of their predecessors, within the increased loss, there are fewer efforts to collectively preserve Black land. And one of my landowners said, my wife won't do it and my sons don't want it. And that in itself can be a limitation to the education that could occur or any sort of policy change, because if simply the next generation of those who are to take on and build up this land are not there to do it, or are not there to understand the skills of using prescribed fire and the purposes that it has for even the habitat or for their farm, it can make it harder for a landowner to be so inclined to want to do more, because they know that past the next 20 to 40 years or 60 years, because most of my landowners were at 50s plus, they don't have somebody who is going to come back and do that. So the third is underrepresentation. And so this was not asked to all of my interview participants, and that wasn't on purpose. It was just something that in the middle of the process, I just started to think just about myself as a student, or myself in the space, or myself, on the front lines of a prescribed fire. Like, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And where do we play into that? So I asked the landowners if through the organization and affiliations, the places that they seek the education and they seek the help and help them do prescribed burns, do they feel that there's African American representation through those networks? And one of my landowners said, no, it's not enough representation for the dark or Black people. And the second one said, yeah, it's two different worlds. You're still in this world and there's still another world racially. So that instantly jumped out to me, that there has to be space created and conversations happening around the racism that is also still in the sphere of what we do on land, or what we do to conduct fire, or just in general and natural resources where we work. That way we can better connect to individuals who are so different from us, especially those minority private landowners who we still depend on to conduct things like prescribed fire and proper land management for our natural resources as a whole. So overall, the implications that I have lined out here are that these organizations, affiliations, outreach, etc., should focus on localizing efforts to aid landowners with access to information in the capacity that they might need. So, and if an NRCS county or extension agent knows their landowner base, or gets to know their landowner base, or has the working time to know their landowner base, they could achieve more things by not having the landowners export themselves or drive. One of my landowners drove over 200 miles to a Longleaf Alliance meeting. And those aren't things that a farmer can be, you can't always be reimbursed for you seeking education, but if it's in your area and it's around what happens in your county and the resources that your county needs or your state needs, it can be better. And then as well, offering education catered to burning small land holdings, state level permitting processes, safe burning practices, fire weather, and smoke liability. As well, providing African American landowners opportunities to purchase Black owned land. There's some organizations in South Carolina and Alabama that are doing it, but a holistic effort. I think it's slowly the wheels turning. I think it's the Uniform Heirs Property Act that just came out a few months ago in Florida was just signed, and I'm reading more into that. but as well active engagement with rural communities of color. The reality is that rural communities of color continue to survive and maintain every day, and they're met with many limitations that us who live in cities or in suburbs do not understand and do not know about the rural life that they have taken on for generations. And it's important for us to engage with our communities that way. Again, we can take a more holistic approach to the way in which we are looking at natural resources and the people who are involved in it. And the last is the cultural values of land ownership and fire for African Americans. And the first landowner said to me, just from other people in the community, I think, and it was just kind of a basic practice that was done by just about everyone in the area. And then, you know, God ain't making no more land. So I think land is a precious thing and one of the most precious commodities that he has left with us. And I think this just really speaks to the fact that there is a devotion and a resilience that lives within these landowners who have chosen and have lived upon the fact that they would like to continue to have quality and beautiful land that they care about and that their families can be a part of for generations, but they also divert the issues of racism and capitalism that may be confronting them at every doorstep and every avenue, but they can still create this entire culture from where they once began with their ancestors. And I felt that through every conversation that I had with each landowner and every single time that they discussed the importance of fire in their lives and for what they needed. So my conclusions were that prescribed fire use in the eastern United States will most likely continue to increase because we need it. And then wildfires in the western United States may also increase. Larger issues, as I discussed, like racism, venture capitalism, and heirs property are still very prevalent, and they disrupt African American land ownership abilities in many aspects. And then many generations of African Americans have used prescribed fire on their land, and the continuation of that management practice on these lands highlight and share the collective burn story. But overall, African American non-industrial private landowners are burning for the same reasons as other landowners, but they specifically share unique limitations that aren't addressed or aren't able to be addressed through the surveys that we presently have and some of the literature that we have, because they simply are not the respondents interviews, and they simply are not collectively included from what they individually are taking part of. So that is my project. These are my sources, and prepare for any questions or comments, and I appreciate you all for listening to me and hearing about my project.
Thanks, LaPortia. This is Beth Buchanan. I help Margaret with the Southern Blue Ridge Fire Learning Network, and I really enjoyed your presentation. Everybody, if you could put your questions in the chat box, I will read them off to LaPortia. I'm really proud of myself. I have managed to figure out how to get the chat and the presentation up at the same time. So it's my accomplishment for the day. I will first say, Emily mentioned in the chat box that the webinar was recorded and it will be available on the Fire Learning Network website. The website is in the chat box. The address starts with conservationgateway.org, and then you can maneuver your way through to the Fire Learning Network page and see that recording. You've got several thank yous in the chat box, LaPortia.
Thank y'all so much.
The first question that's come in, was there any issue of getting funding for this project, and or did funding play a role in your choice? Fantastic work and presentation.
Issues of funding. I don't think that we really did. I don't think having, I mean, I think it was like a process, but I'm very I wanted to do it, and I wanted to do it by any means possible. It was very fortunate that we got the Sussman Fellowship that kind of came through, you know, and Adam had me apply for that, and we went through the process of that. But overall, I was covered pretty much like on Adam's end for anything that I needed, and it didn't affect my decision. I mean, even if I had done a herp plot study with prescribed fire, I would have been just as happy, you know. I think my decision was really based in me choosing something that I cared about, that I was passionate about, and that I could see myself after graduate school being a part of a community of people, and also understanding that. And it only made it better that it was a place that I will go to for the rest of my life, you know, a place that I can cherish for the rest of my life. It made it that much more better. So not really any funding issues that I could think of right off the gate.
Yeah, we were in a unique situation. Just Portia qualified for the MAOP program at Virginia Tech that she mentioned. So one half of her graduate program overall was provided for by Virginia Tech as the university, because she qualified for that program, both academically and being a female minority. And then the other year was matched by our department. And so the funding to bring her on was matched in that regard. And then she applied for the additional fellowships. Now, to think if we had applied for a grant to maybe address that question or anything like that, there may have been some additional difficulty in that. But because of the unique situation we were in, we were kind of given an opportunity to explore any research topic that was of interest to us. So in that collaboration with Kevin Hires at Tall Timbers was invaluable, because I had already been thinking about some of my experiences with prescribed fire in the coastal plain. I just was curious how, you know, different groups of people and different folks were being interacted with in terms of, you know, their burn objectives and if they were actually burning. So that's kind of how all of it came about. And then the funding, I think, a twofold question. We really didn't have an issue with it for this particular project, but had we been looking for specific grant funding to go after to address this topic, we would have had issues in that regard.
Great, thank you. The second question, did you talk with any of your landowners about their specific experiences with state agency professionals? And if you did, were those experiences largely positive or negative?
So that's something that I didn't get into. I didn't get into the relationships that they were building with. It was just, were they connected with one? Some of the landowners might have mentioned being on a board or being in a committee, or having their local Forest Service come out every year and do their fire lines. I didn't get too much into it, but I did have some landowners who, like, I had no access to unless it was through the extension agent that I talked to, or like there was clearly with some of the landowners who I interviewed with, there was clearly some relationship that they had built where they were entrusting them to give that trust to me to allow me to interview them. But other than that, I didn't ask them any questions pertaining to the way they went about those relationships.
And I think one of the most interesting things that Portia shared with me was that a lot of these folks, if they weren't actively involved in like a prescribed burn association, or they had been going to meetings or anything like that, they kind of homegrown created their own opportunities working with, you know, family members, with other people in the community. They had kind of created their own little associations to get what they needed done, which I think is pretty interesting. Yeah.
To add to that, some of the landowners even talked about the difficulties in that and having like your own local organization on what landowners wanted to share. And I think there's so many layers to this that I probably even haven't got to just myself, you know what I'm saying? Because the landowners have like a long history of the reasons or whys and the connections and so on, so.
Gotcha, thanks. You know, one thing that struck me is you said that one of the folks you interviewed said that they had gone 200 miles to attend a Longleaf Alliance meeting, which is way impressive. And so the next question ties into that. Do you see opportunities for virtual or web-based information sharing on topics like permitting, or are rural landowners limited by slow or limited access to high-speed internet? Was that one of the limitations?
So I didn't know if they had tried like a web situation or organized situation, but I did know that like some of the landowners I had, they didn't have emails, or if they did have an email, it was something they only checked like once a month. Or like one of my landowners, I had to mail them the consent form like the navigations of communication are very like, I'm your neighbor, you're my neighbor, we talk. And so I feel like when you see that happening all around them and you're connecting in that type of way, it's also something that I'm not going to say is automatically expected, but I think that having personal and one-on-one relationships or any sort of relationship between two parties is better than there just being a hovering organization that has power, resources, access, and everything, but you don't always feel comfortable, or they don't always feel comfortable, you know, navigating those seas. Did I miss another part of the question?
No, I think it was just, is internet slow internet or poor internet access a part of that issue? And
yeah, that's something I think you asked, like, would that be a route to take? I don't know. I don't think we should seek or stay on the intention that we will be digital forever, because nothing that, like, just simply for the fact that, like, we can't eat with the digital, you know what I'm saying? We can't see trees grow with the digital. So I think that it will continue to be a process that will have to be conducted safely, but in person, and having those sort of things happen where people can see things implemented. And we also have to realize that no matter what age we were working with different sets of learners all the time, and everybody learns differently, and the way that they are motivated to do things is different. So I think navigating that is also a process of understanding how to educate people on it. So.
Yeah, really good observation. Okay, next question. Were any landowners interviewed already connected with local organizations or agencies to assist them with their forest management?
Right. So yes, NRCS was like a big one that came up. Like I didn't put it in this PowerPoint, but when I first started presenting my research last summer, I made this giant word web of the different organizations that landowners were mentioning, and one of the largest ones was NRCS. But then you also had the local extension agencies, and then as Adam was mentioning, these local organizations that farmers have just got together and created a coalition. So them being connected, that also collected to their overall education on prescribed fire. Like, one of my landowners worked at university, and they had studied the risk and the benefits of prescribed fire, and so they were connected in that way through an institution of higher learning. But as well, you have people who had the Forest Service or had worked with tall timbers before. I had two of my best landowner interviews were within less than maybe a mile of tall timbers, and they were like right there, you know, that for me to talk to and have access to. So they are connected.
Okay. I'm going to talk fast because there's at least 10 more questions for you.
Okay.
Yeah. The next comment in question: great work and great presentation. Your passion for your research shows. What are your thoughts on how messaging should change for these landowners to provide them with better information and education? And who should the trusted messengers be to deliver those messages?
I honestly think the best way is like being quite direct, but I also think that it will come in the process of us restructuring, you know, the spaces that we work and the things that we do, and to be inclusive of all the ideas and everything. And I also think that it will be community members who will be a part of making that information known to these people. For instance, there was a woman who worked with Habitat for Humanity who I met when I was in Tallahassee, and she knew all of these landowners just because she's in the community, she's in the mix, she helps people attain homes and financial freedom and all these sorts of things, and she was just in the mix. And I think that will be a part of when we, larger organizations or larger hubs of resources, get into those communities, and we're talking with the people and getting to know the people around it. Or when you have really cool people like Kevin Hires, who lives in the same city and town, and you know, they navigate those conversations, then the best person to connect with people will have that happen. But you're always going to have it where there might be a couple of people who have the string of information, and then the dissemination will fall, just like with my snowball sampling, like whoever ears catch it to get it and get the information. But I think the best approach is just to try to be direct. Like the Southern, I don't know what I'm trying to say, Federation of Southern Cooperative, sorry. They like send me emails all the time, like minority, small landowner, or I've seen webinars before where they're talking about new farm bill policy or something like that. They are out there, and there are people who probably do attune to those, but I think you just have to be direct of what you want and you want to receive. If you know you want to work with small landowners who have small parcels and they're minorities and you want to focus on that thing, you have to react to your landowner the same way I would react to a singer position for, you know, petite Black woman. Like, I don't know, like, I just feel like being direct and being concrete about your intention and the way in which it works with their land management goals would create better educational discourse.
Thanks. Next comment and question. First, thank you. This was fantastic to hear and watch, and it looks like you did an incredible amount of work. Was there any side comments, something you couldn't code easily maybe, that someone made that stuck with you, be it about prescribed fire, owning land, being a Black landowner, or otherwise?
I don't know about something that I couldn't code easily, but I think in general it's hard to code like experience, or like you can't code the like emotional connection and understanding that you're having when you're sitting and you're talking to somebody. You know what I'm saying? You can't analytically, I don't know how to analytically express that. You know, I can only like be in the space and in the time and doing that. So, but I would say something that stuck with me the most is the two of my landowners who were centennial farmers, sitting there for the time that I sat there and listening to them tell me about how their grandmother and grandfather and everybody was doing this fire. And one of my landowners and his father, when he was a child, he saw his father and his uncles work together to sign a petition so that they could get proper equipment that they needed to farm, as well as learning about turpentine and how that was working in Thomasville at the time, and to have been born your father was a slave, to have been born on property and then you be the owner of that property 80 to 100 some odd years later. Those were things that just were like, whoa, to me. So those are some things that stuck with me. So also just like being on the land is something that stuck with me, that, I mean, there's no written portion to that or nothing I could have put in research that describes what it's like to be on somebody's property who they devote their entire life to. It's a totally different experience.
Yeah, that must have been fascinating. The next question, is there also a decline in rural land ownership among white landowners in the area?
That's not something that I looked into because I was in this specific honing focus of African-American landowners solely in their decline of land ownership. But I don't know how that directly relates to the rural white landowners, because overall there are just simply more white landowners who own more acreages of land just overall.
Sorry, I'm just
You're
trying
good.
to figure out Zoom here,
You're fine.
hitting the button frantically. Okay, next question. From what have you learned with your work here? Are there further questions or work you would like to pursue further? And thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for your question. Thank you. I think something I've learned the most is that people matter. Individual people matter. The people who, you know, you never get to see, but you get to write policy for, or, you know, like the little people matter. They matter so much. And that was something that really stuck with me. But there's so many things I want to pursue. I would love to just like live in Tallahassee and just be able to like constantly go around and talk with and work. I mean, the landowners are doing so many things. They're doing everything from prescribed fire to growing pecans to raising cows from babies. So it's like, there's so many things to learn. But I would love to do some sort of situation where we did operate workshops, in-person work. That was, if I was to go into a PhD or something further, I wanted to try to operate educational workshops around the topics that I discussed, and then get that landowner survey feedback and see how it works over time. I also would love to try to do this rapid rural appraisal method in other regions of the United States where fire is occurring. In the Western United States, there's a lot of things that I feel like I could do with this to just kind of gauge more nationally what it would look like.
Thanks. Next question. The Black Lives Matter movement has taught privileged white people like me that it is not enough to be an open-minded person, but we have an obligation to actively change the system that keeps white privilege going. What would you like to see your white colleagues who have an interest in prescribed fire to make the fire system better?
I guess, look, I don't I'm not good with questions like this. I would just say talk to people, you know? Like if you're gonna be burning in a small county in Alabama and that's where you for the day where, you know, set out this is the area you're gonna burn or something, I would talk to the people who are around your burn, hear their concerns and ideas, hear the ways that they learned how to burn. Like I'd never known that people were actually using matches to burn the woods until I was sitting there with somebody who told me they've been doing it their whole life. So I think it's about having conversations. I think it's about being bigger than science because science is not, you know, it's not the whole world. We're bigger than frequency and severity and, you know, all of these things. So I think that those are the things I would say is to have invoking and exciting and intriguing conversations with people who do not look like you and understand what they require and also what they've been doing and concerned to prescribe fire. Or ask them, do they know what prescribed fire is? And you know what I'm saying? Like you're also a voice of education and a reason and a resource. So that's my suggestion. And don't be mean because you don't know everything either. I think that's the other thing.
Thanks. Thank you for your eye-opening presentation, LaPortia. In terms of educational opportunity for Black landowners, do you think the people you interviewed would be more interested or comfortable attending in-person trainings with a primarily Black audience, or would they attend meetings with predominantly white audience? How can cooperative extension agents encourage participation of minorities in existing outreach efforts? Or do the formats and topics of outreach efforts need to be fundamentally changed to meet their needs? That was a bunch of questions, so if you want me to read them off one by one, that helps my brain, so let me know if you want me to.
Oh, so I can see it on the side.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to scroll with you because I'm a visual learner, not auditory, so I would not know otherwise. So to answer your first questions, I do think they need to be fundamentally changed because most of the landowners that I spoke to, it was all about we will take the education, we will take the advice, we will take the things as long as it fits into the goals and things that we require. Some landowners will have absolutely, another one of our Centennial farmers had absolutely no interest further than the information that they were already receiving from a greater organization through email or mailing. But I also think that I feel like if we had only trainings with the only Black audience, I don't think that fits into having a diverse conversation or an inclusive conversation. And I understand to start off, like maybe that is what people could automatically feel comfortable with, but I think you would have to gauge the group that you're working with. I also believe that having a predominantly white audience will not help because it's very awkward and unappeasing. And when you've been discriminated or alienized or othered by a group of people for so long in your career or whatever it is that you're doing, it will only make it more difficult to attain the education or whatever it is that you came to the workshop to receive. So I think that changing it towards those landowner needs, those small parcel landowners, those minority landowner needs, and what they want for their property, whether it simply be to promote soil growth or have an old growth longleaf forest, you know? Yeah.
Thanks. How can we highlight the existing landowner organizations that are burning to spread the word and expertise to other landowners that seem interested? Do Learn and Burns help? Can we do fire festivals where African American landowners do the teaching? Other ideas?
I think That would be great. Any sort of exercise that brings people together would be a great thing. Like I'm sure you've seen like with the Black Lives Matter movement, everything going on, plenty of like Black environmentalists or, Black foresters or whoever they are that already have the skills that we don't see because they're in a room for other people that cast a shadow over them. So you don't, know. But I think that most definitely, organizations should spread the word and should create things that foster a sense of community with not only African American landowners but Native landowners. And we can start. And then when you have those ideas, when you have all of these different identities of in a room, you can begin to have conversation and discourse on the issues, benefits, risks, all of the topics happening that affect them all differently. So maybe there will be a start towards each of the organizations simply just like spreading the word about prescribed fire and its importance and trying to get that to the people, and then engaging them with these activities that could be quarterly, annually, that occur where you have your strong minority land base that that you work with, that you have connections with, can come together and they can teach to the communities that they know and the communities that they serve and to the people who look like them so they can understand. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Wow, well, we put a bunch of questions to you there at the end, and you still have as much enthusiasm and energy now as you did at the beginning of the hour. Thank you so much. Adam, did you want to say anything before I turn it back over to Emily? It's a couple minutes after the hour right now, and hopefully everybody can stick around for a couple more minutes.
No, I think I'm great. She mentioned everything. I think the takeaway for me was just what we assumed maybe to be true at the beginning was not what was actually true, is that there were all these, kind of overarching reasons why African Americans were choosing to burn or not that were so different that we wouldn't understand. But it just seemed to be that a lot of the reasons they were burning were very similar to what, all of the other survey respondents had been that were predominantly white. But the kind of limitations for them were just so much more marked and really pointed. They didn't feel like they have equal representation, within agencies. They distrusted those groups and didn't respond to surveys, so therefore their opinions were never really taken into account. And just overall, LaPortia is now a wealth of knowledge about how just after the Civil War with African American landowners. So it was really this kind of holistic, approach to what has gone on to really shape African American land ownership in the last, 100 or so years, to make things kind of be the situation that they are. So appreciate you all giving us the opportunity to share, and LaPortia for being just an amazing researcher. So
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Emily, I'll turn it over to you now. Thanks again, LaPortia and Adam.
Yeah, thank you both for moderating that question and answer. Thank you so much, LaPortia. Thank you, Adam. What a wonderful presentation and such important information. Thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us today. Again, we will share the recording of this via email and also on the website at the link that I provided earlier. So definitely look for that and please share it widely. And LaPortia, Adam, if there are any other products that come out of this, any write-ups or anything else that we can share, please do send that along. I would love to distribute that to the Fire Learning Network. I'm sure people will be very interested in seeing.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Thank y'all.